The smell of sweet potato pie was still warm in the air, when my brother Marcus's voice sliced through the family chatter like a blade. "Just leave. Nobody wants you here anyway." The crystal stemware rattled when my father slammed his fist on the mahogany table, his face twisted with rage. "Get out of my house. Now!" My 6-year-old daughter Zara clutched my arm, her small fingers digging into my burgundy sweater, her dark eyes wide with terror and confusion. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Around the dining table, my brother smirked, adjusting his expensive Rolex. My sister Kenya rolled her eyes, scrolling through her iPhone like this was entertainment. My mother looked away, suddenly fascinated by the gravy boat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Somewhere between the honey-glazed turkey and the fine china that had been inherited from my grandmother, I realized this wasn't a Thanksgiving dinner. This was a public execution of my dignity. What none of them knew was that everything in this house, the mortgage on this 6-bedroom suburban mansion in Buckhead, the luxury cars in the circular driveway, even the private school tuition for my nephew Cameron, had been quietly funded by the woman they were throwing out. Me. The same woman they'd been calling a failure for the past 8 years. So I took a deep breath, held my daughter's trembling hand, and said just one word: "Fine." The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound came from the soft jazz playing through the built-in surround sound system, its melody floating across the polished hardwood floors that I had paid to install. My father's chest heaved as he glared at me, his hands clenched at his sides. "You've embarrassed this family enough," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "Walking around here acting like some victim, like you haven't brought this shame on yourself. Single mother, no husband, dragging that child around like some kind of charity case." I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to speak. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear anything else over the sound of blood rushing in my ears. Across the table, Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his aged cognac with a satisfied grin. The same cognac I'd bought him for his birthday last month, though he'd never know that either. "Come on, Dad," he drawled, his voice carrying that same condescending tone he'd perfected since we were children. "She's used to people giving up on her. Remember Devin?" The name hit like a physical blow to my chest. My ex-fiancé. My mistake. My daughter's father who disappeared the moment he found out I was pregnant, claiming he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. My mother, always the diplomat when it suited her, sighed dramatically. "Marcus, that's enough," she said, though her tone carried about as much conviction as a whisper in a hurricane. Then she turned to me, her expression heavy with the kind of false sympathy she'd perfected over decades of playing peacekeeper. "Keisha, honey, you should have known this would happen. Showing up here unannounced with your child, expecting everyone to just pretend everything's okay after what happened last Christmas. Last Christmas. When I'd made the mistake of mentioning that I was working on something big, something that could change our lives. When my father had laughed in my face and said, 'Still chasing those computer dreams, I see. When are you going to grow up and get a real job?' I felt Zara shift against me, her small voice barely a whisper. 'Grandma, I just wanted to see the pretty flowers.' She looked toward the elaborate centerpiece, fresh peonies and roses that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. Another expense I'd covered without them knowing. My mother's face softened briefly, the way it always did when she looked at Zara. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman who used to read me bedtime stories, who used to defend me when I came home crying from school. But then she caught my father's glare, and the mask slipped back into place. I knelt down, brushing away a tear from Zara's cheek. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, my voice steadier than I felt. "We've seen enough pretty things for one day." My father's voice boomed again, that same authoritative tone that had dominated my childhood. "Don't make this about leaving, Keisha. You made your choices. Dropping out of that engagement with a good man, quitting that stable job at the bank, chasing those ridiculous tech fantasies like you're some kind of genius. You made your bed, now you need to lie in it. A good man. Devin had cheated on me twice that I knew of, belittled my ambitions at every turn, and told me I was too intense about my work. But in my father's eyes, any man with a decent salary was a good catch, regardless of how he treated me. I straightened, meeting his eyes for what felt like the first time in years. "You're right," I said quietly, my voice carrying a calm that surprised even me. I did make my choices. Then live with the consequences, he barked, his face getting redder. Stop expecting this family to coddle you every time reality doesn't match your fantasies. The irony was suffocating. The mortgage payment on this very house, the 2 Lexus SUVs outside, the European vacation Kenya had just returned from where she'd posted Instagram stories from 5-star hotels. All of it existed because of my ridiculous tech fantasies. I could have said it then. I could have told them that my company, Neural Sync Technologies, had just been valued at $35 million by 3 different acquisition firms, that I was about to become one of the youngest Black women in history to have a tech exit of that magnitude, that I was the invisible hand that had been paying their bills and covering their overdrafts for the past 3 years, the anonymous benefactor they'd been thanking God for in their prayers. But looking at their faces, at my father's rigid pride, my brother's arrogance, my mother's fragile mask of superiority, I realized the truth would do nothing but deepen the divide. They weren't ready to see me for who I was. They might never be ready. "Come on, Zara," I said softly, taking her hand. "Let's go home." "Don't turn this into another one of your pity parties," Marcus called after me, his voice dripping with the kind of cruelty that only siblings can perfect. "You're not the victim here. You just can't handle being ordinary like the rest of us." Ordinary. The word hung in the air like smoke. I opened my mouth to respond, felt the words building in my throat, all the achievements and accolades and recognition they'd never bothered to acknowledge. But then I stopped. It wasn't worth it. I'd spent too many years trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I had none. As we crossed the living room, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the massive gold-framed mirror above the fireplace, the same mirror where family photos should have been displayed, but somehow never included many pictures of me. My face was calm, too calm, like the surface of water right before a storm. Behind me, the glow of the crystal chandelier shimmered like a memory I was already beginning to erase. I had worn a simple burgundy sweater dress that day, one Zara had chosen because she said it made me look like a princess. I looked modest, unassuming, exactly how I'd learned to appear around them. Let them think I was struggling. Let them underestimate me. It had served me well so far. At the front door, my mother's voice wavered with the kind of emotion she only showed when she thought someone might be watching. "Keisha, wait," she said, taking a hesitant step forward. "It's Thanksgiving. Don't ruin it for your daughter. She shouldn't have to suffer because you can't get along with your family." I turned slowly, feeling the weight of 28 years of similar conversations, similar accusations, similar attempts to make me the problem. "I'm not the one ruining anything, Mom," she faltered, her gaze flicking between me and Zara. "You know how your father gets when he's stressed. The real estate market has been tough lately. He doesn't mean half of what he says. The familiar script, the excuses, the decades of silence dressed up as keeping the peace. My father had been stressed my entire life, and somehow that stress always seemed to land squarely on my shoulders. I had played this role too long, been the family scapegoat too many times. "Goodbye, Mom," I said, opening the heavy oak door they'd had custom-made last year with money from the trust fund they thought was a blessing from heaven. Cold November air rushed in, carrying the scent of burning leaves and approaching winter. Zara's small hand tightened around mine, her palm warm and slightly sticky from the candied yams she'd barely gotten to taste before everything exploded. Behind us, I could hear my father muttering something about respect and ungrateful children, words that had followed me like shadows since childhood. The words no longer cut the way they used to. Time and success had built calluses around my heart. As we stepped outside, golden leaves swirled around our feet like confetti at a celebration I'd never been invited to attend. Zara looked up at me, her breath visible in the crisp November air, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mommy, did we do something wrong?" I knelt to her level, my knees touching the cold brick steps, and brushed a curl from her face. The same curls I'd been teased about as a child. The same hair texture my mother had tried to chemically straighten every 6 weeks until I was old enough to refuse. "No, sweetheart," I said softly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "Sometimes grown-ups forget what family really means." She blinked, her 6-year-old mind processing this information the way children do, accepting the incomprehensible with grace that adults seem to lose somewhere along the way. "Will we still have turkey when we get home?" I smiled despite the ache spreading through my chest. "We'll make our own Thanksgiving, baby. Just you and me, with all your favorite foods." "Even mac and cheese?" she asked, her face brightening. "Especially mac and cheese." We walked down the brick driveway, our footsteps echoing in the quiet suburban afternoon. The house behind us glowed warm and inviting, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing glimpses of the family still gathered around the dining table, probably already moving on to dessert, already forgetting that we'd been there at all. It was a picture-perfect Thanksgiving scene that had never truly included us anyway. I started my Honda Civic, the modest car I drove despite being able to afford a fleet of luxury vehicles, and watched through the windshield as my family's silhouettes moved behind the sheer curtains, still together, still laughing, still completely blind to what they'd just lost. Kenya was probably already posting photos on Instagram with captions about being grateful for family, using hashtags about love and blessings while conveniently cropping out any evidence that I'd been there. Marcus was likely telling some story about his latest business venture, funded by money he didn't know came from me. My parents were nodding approvingly, their pride in their successful children as artificial as the flowers in the centerpiece. Zara curled up in her car seat, hugging her stuffed elephant, a gift from her teacher who'd noticed she sometimes seemed sad after family gatherings. "Where are we going, Mommy?" "Somewhere that appreciates us," I whispered, my voice carrying promises I intended to keep. As we pulled away, I let the engine's gentle hum drown out the past. Every mile felt like shedding another layer of shame, of old expectations, of the desperate need to belong to people who had never truly wanted me there in the first place. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. Out of habit, I glanced at my phone when it buzzed with a notification. A text from my business partner, Maya. "Contract signed. Congratulations, Kay. Neuralink just hit $35 million valuation. The Goldman Sachs team wants to meet Monday to discuss acquisition terms. You did it, girl. You actually did it." I stared at the number on my phone screen, then back at the suburban mansion fading in the rearview mirror. $35 million. The number felt abstract, like play money from a board game. I murmured it under my breath, testing how it sounded in the empty space my family had left behind. Zara stirred, half asleep but still curious. "Is that a lot, Mommy?" "It's enough, baby," I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of years of struggle and sacrifice. "More than enough for us to build whatever kind of life we want." We drove through the autumn afternoon, the leaves falling like golden snow around us, each one catching the light before spiraling to the ground. Somewhere between the miles of tree-lined streets and the steady beating of my heart, I made a promise to myself that felt like an oath sworn in a cathedral. No more hiding who I was. No more begging for a seat at a table that was never set for me. No more apologizing for my success or dimming my light to make others comfortable. Next Thanksgiving, we wouldn't be guests in someone else's house, walking on eggshells and hoping for scraps of acceptance. We would create our own traditions, filled with warmth, respect, and love that didn't come with conditions or asterisks. For now, though, I let the music from the radio guide us toward home. Some old-school R&B was playing, the kind my grandmother used to sing while she cooked, back when I still believed families were supposed to celebrate each other's victories. Zara's breathing slowed to the rhythm of sleep, steady and peaceful in a way that reminded me why I fought so hard for our future. I reached over, gently stroking her hair, and felt something shift in my chest. Not heartbreak. I'd grieved the loss of my family's love years ago. This felt more like relief, like finally setting down a suitcase I'd been carrying for decades. "Happy Thanksgiving, Princess," I whispered to my sleeping daughter. "We're finally free." The road stretched ahead like a promise, as autumn leaves danced across the windshield, in patterns that reminded me of the code I used to write by candlelight during those first brutal months of building my company. I drove in comfortable silence, the soft R&B from the radio mixing with my thoughts like a soundtrack to my liberation. The farther we got from that house, the clearer everything became, as if distance was wiping fog from a mirror I hadn't realized was clouded. I realized the voice that had ordered me out of the house was the same one that had undermined every achievement of my life for 28 years. My father's tone hadn't changed since I was a little girl, presenting him with straight-A report cards, hoping for a smile that never came. He'd only grown louder because I'd finally stopped being quiet, stopped shrinking, stopped apologizing for taking up space in a world that had tried to convince me I didn't belong. When I was little, our house in suburban Atlanta was the kind of place that looked perfect from the street. Manicured lawn maintained by a landscaping service, luxury cars detailed every weekend, and a facade that screamed success to every neighbor who drove by. But inside, it felt like walking through a museum where everything was beautiful and nothing was meant to be touched. My father, Robert Williams, was the kind of man who believed respect came through dominance and fear. He was a real estate developer who'd built his empire by intimidating people into deals that favored him, and he brought that same energy home every evening. My mother, Patricia, was the eternal diplomat, always smoothing over his harshness with nervous laughter and deflection, as if his cruelty was just another household appliance that occasionally malfunctioned, but was too expensive to replace. Marcus, my older brother by 3 years, could do no wrong in their eyes. He was the golden son, the one who got a business degree from Morehouse and followed Dad into real estate development without ever questioning whether it was what he actually wanted to do with his life. Kenya, my younger sister by 2 years, was the princess, celebrated for her beauty and her ability to charm wealthy men into relationships that looked good on paper, even if they were emotionally bankrupt. And then there was me, the middle child, the quiet one, the afterthought who filled the space between their accomplishments with invisible presence and desperate attempts to prove I was worthy of the love they gave so freely to my siblings. I learned early that in our family, love was conditional, distributed based on compliance rather than character. My father's attention was earned through conformity, not innovation. When he spoke to me, it wasn't to ask about my dreams or encourage my passions. It was to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy, which was always somewhere near the bottom. Stand straight. Smile more. Don't think you're better than your family, he'd say whenever I showed excitement about school projects or talked about wanting to work with computers. He liked compliance, not creativity. He wanted daughters who would marry well and sons who would expand his business empire, not children who might venture into territories he didn't understand or control. My mother, who'd once dreamed of becoming an artist before she met my father, had traded her paintbrushes for PTA meetings and charity galas that enhanced her social standing. She'd squeeze my shoulder when Dad criticized me and whisper, "Just do what makes him happy, honey. It's easier that way." And she was right. It was easier to go along, to keep quiet, to blend into the background. But it was also soul-crushing, like slowly suffocating on air that was perfectly breathable for everyone else. The first time I understood how deep the favoritism ran was at my middle school science fair. I was 12, and I'd spent weeks building a computer program that could predict weather patterns based on historical data. It wasn't sophisticated by today's standards, but for a 12-year-old working with library books and a second-hand computer, it was groundbreaking. That night, standing behind my display board with a ribbon for first place pinned to my shirt, I searched the crowd of parents for familiar faces. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had specifically invited families to attend because she wanted them to see what their children were capable of. Marcus was there with a participation trophy from his basketball tournament, basking in my parents' praise for showing up and doing his best. Kenya had brought a drawing she'd made in art class, which my mother was already planning to frame for the hallway. When they finally reached my table, I started explaining my project with the kind of enthusiasm that only children can muster when they're genuinely excited about something they've created. My father listened for about 30 seconds before checking his watch. "That's nice, sweetie, but this computer stuff is pretty complicated. Are you sure you understand all of it?" Mrs. Rodriguez stepped in, her voice firm but polite. "Actually, Mr. Williams, Keisha designed and coded this entire program herself. She's been staying after school for weeks to perfect it. You should be very proud." My mother smiled politely, but I could see her eyes glazing over the way they always did when the conversation turned to anything technical. "Well, that's wonderful, honey. But remember, computers can't do everything. People's skills are what really matter in life." My father nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Marcus here is already making friends with college recruiters, and Kenya's got that natural charm that'll take her far. Those are real skills that'll pay off in the real world. I stood there holding my first place ribbon, watching them beam with pride over my siblings' accomplishments, while treating mine like a curiosity, something interesting but ultimately unimportant. That was the night I learned that excellence meant nothing if the people you wanted recognition from weren't paying attention, or worse, if they were actively choosing to look away. By high school, I'd become an expert at being invisible, at existing in the spaces between their expectations and their attention. While my siblings filled the house with noise and drama, Marcus with his football friends, Kenya with her phone calls about boys and makeup, I filled notebooks with code and sketches of algorithms I didn't yet understand, but somehow intuited. I stopped expecting anyone to notice my achievements. Instead, I poured myself into academics because numbers never argued, never compared me unfavorably to my siblings, never asked me to be more like someone else. When my report card came back with straight A's, my father barely looked up from his newspaper. "Grades don't mean much in the real world," he'd say dismissively. "Look at Marcus. He's already making connections with his teammates' fathers who own businesses. That's networking. That's how you get ahead in life." Lauren's beauty pageant photos lined the hallway leading to my parents' bedroom. Marcus's trophies filled the living room shelves, arranged like a shrine to athletic mediocrity. My academic achievements were kept in a drawer in my desk, certificates and award letters that I read and reread in private, trying to convince myself they mattered, even if no one else seemed to think so. When I was 15, I was accepted into an advanced summer science program at Georgia Tech. It was competitive, prestigious, and completely free for students who qualified based on merit. I was one of only 12 students chosen from across the entire state. I practically vibrated with excitement when I got the acceptance letter, imagining how proud my parents would be when they realized their daughter had been selected for something so exclusive. My father's response was immediate and deflating. "That's nice, but are there any boys in this program? You need to be careful about spending too much time around all those smart kids. Boys don't like girls who are smarter than them." My mother laughed as if he'd said something endearing rather than devastating. "Your father's right, honey. Intelligence is wonderful, but you don't want to intimidate potential boyfriends. Maybe you could take some cooking classes this summer instead. Or learn a foreign language. Those are skills that'll make you more well-rounded." I laughed along with them, but inside I felt something closing off, like a door being sealed shut and locked from the inside. That night, lying in my childhood bed surrounded by science fair ribbons they'd never bothered to display, I made my first real decision about who I was going to become. I was going to that program, and I was going to excel, not for their approval, but despite their disapproval. The program was 8 weeks of intensive study with some of the brightest teenagers in the country. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who spoke my language, who got excited about algorithms and data structures and the infinite possibilities of technology. Our instructor, Dr. Sarah Johnson, was a Black woman who'd earned her PhD from MIT and worked for NASA before transitioning into academia. On the first day, she looked at all 12 of us, mostly boys, mostly white, mostly convinced of their own genius, and said something I'll never forget. "Some of you are here because you've been told you're special your whole lives. Others are here despite being told you're not special enough." The second group almost always does better, because they're used to working twice as hard for half the recognition. The question is, what are you going to do with that superpower? She looked directly at me when she said it, and I felt something shift in my chest, like tumblers falling into place in a lock I didn't know existed. For 8 weeks, I immersed myself in programming languages and computational theory. I built my first real application, a database system that could track and analyze student performance across multiple metrics. It wasn't revolutionary, but it worked, and it was mine. When Dr. Johnson reviewed it, she didn't just praise the code. She saw the thinking behind it. "You have an intuitive understanding of how data wants to move," she told me during our final meeting. "That's not something you can teach. That's something you're born with." When I got home, sunburned and exhausted and absolutely exhilarated, I couldn't wait to tell my family about everything I'd learned. I'd brought my project home on a floppy disk, planning to show them what I'd built during those 8 weeks away. The living room was full when I walked in. Marcus and some of his friends watching a basketball game, Kenya painting her nails on the coffee table, my parents reading the newspaper and magazine. I stood in the doorway for a moment, holding my disc like a talisman. "Hey, everyone," I said, my voice bright with excitement. "I'm back." Marcus glanced over briefly. "Cool. How was computer camp?" "It was incredible," I started, moving toward the television to show them what I'd built. "I created this program that can—" "Honey, not right now," my mother interrupted without looking up from her magazine. "Can't you see we're in the middle of something? Maybe later." I stood there for a moment, the disc heavy in my hand, watching my family continue with their evening as if I hadn't been gone for 2 months, as if I hadn't just had the most formative experience of my young life. Later never came. They never asked about the program again, never wanted to see what I'd created, never showed any curiosity about what I'd learned. That night, I uploaded my project to the family computer and left it on the desktop with a file name that clearly explained what it was. For weeks, I checked to see if anyone had opened it, if anyone was curious enough to look. The file sat untouched until I finally deleted it to make room for my father's golf game software. By junior year of high school, I'd stopped trying to share my achievements with my family altogether. When I won the state-level coding competition, I didn't mention it at dinner. When I was featured in the local newspaper for creating an app that helped elderly residents connect with volunteer services, I quietly kept the article in my backpack rather than bringing it home. I learned that silence was the safest language in our house. When you didn't speak, they couldn't twist your words or diminish your accomplishments. When you didn't ask for love, they couldn't deny it to your face. I moved through the house like a shadow, helping with chores when asked, staying out of arguments, existing between their expectations. But not every adult I encountered believed I was invisible or unworthy of attention. My computer science teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, noticed the way I stayed after class to help fix the lab computers when they malfunctioned. One afternoon, after I'd spent my lunch period debugging a particularly stubborn network issue, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said something that still echoes in my mind today. "You've got a mind built for creation, Keisha. Don't waste it trying to please people who can't see what you're capable of." His words burned brighter than any praise I'd ever received at home, mainly because they came from someone who actually understood what I was doing, who recognized the value in it. For the first time in years, someone didn't see me as the quiet disappointment. They saw potential. The night I got my acceptance letter to Georgia Tech with a full academic scholarship, I ran down the stairs with my heart pounding, clutching the envelope like it contained the secret to everything I'd ever wanted. "Mom! Dad! I got in! Full scholarship to Georgia Tech for computer science." My mother looked up from the bills she was organizing, surprised, but not necessarily pleased. That's wonderful, honey. But Georgia Tech is so far away. And computer science? Are you sure that's practical for a young woman?" My father frowned, setting down his newspaper with the kind of deliberate motion that usually preceded a lecture. "College is expensive, even with a scholarship. There are living expenses, books, transportation. And what kind of job are you going to get with a computer science degree? How many Black women do you see working in technology? It's a full scholarship, Dad. Everything is covered. And the tech industry is growing. Growing for men," he interrupted. "You'd be better off choosing something more stable. Teaching, maybe. Or nursing. Those are careers where you can help people and still have time for a family." Kenya looked up from her phone, finally interested in the conversation. "Wait, you want to move to Atlanta? That's like really far. What if you meet someone there and never come back?" "That's exactly what I'm worried about," my mother said, her voice taking on that familiar tone of concern that always seemed to be directed at containing my ambitions rather than encouraging them. "You're so young, Keisha. You don't understand how hard the world can be for women, especially Black women in fields dominated by men. Maybe you should think about staying closer to home, going to the community college for a couple of years first." I looked around the room at their faces, searching for any sign of pride or excitement or recognition of what this scholarship meant. Georgia Tech was one of the top engineering schools in the country. Less than 30% of their computer science students were women, and an even smaller percentage were Black women. I was 17 years old, and I'd just earned my way into a program that could change the entire trajectory of my life. But instead of celebration, I was getting warnings and doubts and suggestions to aim lower. "This is what I want," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. I've wanted this since I was 12 years old. I'm good at it. Really good." My father shook his head, his expression mixing frustration with what I think he believed was paternal wisdom. "You'll be back," he said finally. "The world's not kind to girls who think they can do everything by themselves. You'll see." On my 18th birthday, instead of a celebration, he handed me a small suitcase with a ribbon tied around the handle. "For when you're ready to come home," he said, as if my departure for college was a temporary rebellion, rather than the first step toward the life I was meant to live. My mother hugged me at the bus station the day I left, her eyes damp, but her smile forced. "Call us when you get settled," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "And please, honey, don't argue with your father about this. He just wants what's best for you." I looked at her, this woman who'd given up her own artistic dreams to become the perfect wife and mother, and almost said, "So do I, Mom. So do I." But I just nodded, shouldered my backpack, and climbed onto the Greyhound bus that would take me away from everything I'd known and toward everything I hoped to become. The bus pulled away from the station, and our house, our neighborhood, our small definition of what was possible for someone like me, faded into the distance. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small or overlooked, or like an afterthought in someone else's story. I felt terrified and exhilarated and completely, utterly free. Freedom, I learned over the next 4 years, doesn't come with an instruction manual. It comes with silence and possibility, and the responsibility to define yourself when no one else is willing to do it for you. I promised myself, somewhere between the bus station and the Georgia state line, that I would build a life where I didn't have to ask anyone for permission to exist, to dream, to achieve. The first few months at Georgia Tech were overwhelming in the best possible way. The campus buzzed with the kind of confidence that comes from being surrounded by people who've been told their whole lives they could be anything they wanted. I didn't know how to belong among them at first. My clothes were simple, purchased from discount stores during back-to-school sales. My background was ordinary in a sea of students whose parents were doctors and engineers and executives. But I had something many of them didn't. I was hungry. Not just for success, but for proof that my sacrifices and solitude had been worth something. I worked part-time at the campus library to afford textbooks that my scholarship didn't cover, ate ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I care to remember, and studied until my eyes burned and my fingers ached from typing. My freshman roommate was a girl named Ashley from Savannah, whose father was a prominent lawyer, and whose mother had attended Georgia Tech in the 80s. Ashley was sweet, but she couldn't understand why I stayed in our dorm room every Friday night instead of going to parties or social events. "You need to network," she'd tell me, applying makeup for another mixer or Greek life event. "College isn't just about grades. It's about connections." But for the first time in my life, my silence was a strength rather than a survival mechanism. I listened more than I spoke. I observed the dynamics around me, learned how confidence was performed in these circles, adapted to the rhythms of academic life that valued intellectual curiosity over social compliance. I joined the computer science club during my second semester because the idea of solving problems with logic and creativity fascinated me in a way that social events never would. That's where I met David Chen, a sophomore from California who became my first real friend in college. David didn't care that my family wasn't wealthy or connected. He cared that I could debug his code faster than anyone else in the club, and that I asked questions that made him think differently about problems he'd been struggling with for weeks. "Where have you been hiding?" he asked, after I suggested a more efficient algorithm for a project he'd been working on for months. "You just made something that was giving me headaches look simple." I smiled, realizing that maybe I didn't have to hide anymore. Maybe I'd just been waiting for the right audience. Every success I found on campus felt like a small rebellion against the voice in my head that sounded like my father, warning me that I was reaching too high, dreaming too big, forgetting my place in the world. Each A on a test, every project completed ahead of schedule, was proof that invisibility could be transformed into a different kind of power if you learned how to move through it with intention rather than shame. My father's voice still echoed in my mind during late-night study sessions. Those warnings about women in technology, about the importance of not intimidating potential boyfriends, about the value of staying close to home where family could keep me grounded. But it grew fainter with each semester, each achievement, each moment when I proved to myself that his limitations weren't mine. Sometimes during those late-night coding sessions in the computer lab, I'd picture that science fair when I was 12, the empty chair where my father should have been sitting, the polite dismissal of my accomplishments. But now the memory didn't sting the way it used to. It motivated me. It reminded me that the absence of applause could be its own kind of freedom if you learned to clap for yourself. Years later, standing outside my dorm after receiving my first internship offer from a major tech company, I called home with news I was sure would finally bridge the gap between us. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice cautious in the way it always was when I called unexpectedly. "Keisha, is everything all right? You usually email." "Everything's great, Mom." I got an internship offer from Microsoft in Seattle. It's paid, and it's exactly the kind of opportunity I've been working toward. There was a pause, and I could hear the television in the background, some news program my father always watched after dinner. That's wonderful, honey. But Microsoft? In Seattle? That's so far away. I waited for the rest, for pride or excitement, or recognition of what this meant for my future. Instead, I got the familiar litany of concerns. "Your father says those tech companies work people to death," she continued. "And Seattle is so expensive. Are you sure you wouldn't be better off finding something closer to home? Atlanta has plenty of opportunities, and you'd be near family." I closed my eyes, leaning against the brick wall of my dorm, and felt that old, familiar disappointment settle in my chest like sediment. "It's Microsoft, Mom. This is exactly what I've been working toward for the past 3 years. I know, honey, and we're proud of you. It's just, well, your father worries that all this computer work is keeping you from meeting nice young men. You're 21 now. Most girls your age are at least dating seriously." As I hung up the phone, standing there in the Georgia twilight with the campus bells chiming in the distance, I realized something that felt both heartbreaking and liberating. I would never get the validation I'd been seeking from them. They would never see me the way Dr. Johnson had seen me, the way my professor saw me, the way I was learning to see myself. But for the first time, that was okay. I didn't need their applause anymore. I was learning to clap for myself. The internship at Microsoft was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. Seattle was gray and caffeinated, and full of people who spoke my language fluently. For 10 weeks, I worked on machine learning algorithms that would eventually help detect cybersecurity threats in real time. My supervisor, Dr. Angela Foster, was a Black woman who'd been at Microsoft for 8 years and had worked her way up to leading one of their most innovative teams. "You have an intuitive understanding of how data moves through systems," she told me during my mid-internship review. "That's not something we can teach. That's something you either have or you don't. You have it." For the first time since I was 12 years old, I felt truly seen by someone who understood what I was capable of. Dr. Foster became more than a supervisor. She became a mentor, someone who'd walk the path I was trying to navigate and could warn me about the obstacles ahead. "There aren't many of us in this field," she told me during one of our weekly check-ins. "That means you're going to face challenges that have nothing to do with your technical abilities and everything to do with other people's assumptions about what you can and can't do. But it also means you have opportunities to be a pioneer, to build something that didn't exist before you decided to create it." When the internship ended, I had job offers from 3 different companies, and the kind of confidence that comes from proving to yourself that your dreams aren't just fantasies. I called home to share the news, expecting that surely this time, this level of success from such recognizable companies would finally earn me the pride I'd been seeking for so long. My father answered the phone, and I could hear the baseball game in the background. "Hey, Dad, I wanted to tell you about the job offers I got from the internship." "Job offers already? You haven't even graduated yet." "That's how it works in tech," I explained. "Companies recruit early for the best candidates. I got offers from Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. All of them are above market rate for entry-level positions." There was a pause, and I could hear him mute the television. "That's great, Keisha, really. But don't get ahead of yourself. Those big companies, they hire a lot of people and lay them off just as fast when the market changes. You might want to think about something more stable. Dad, these are some of the most successful companies in the world. This is exactly what I've been working toward. I'm just saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Maybe look into some government jobs too. Civil service has good benefits, and the work is steady." When I hung up, I realized that no level of achievement was going to change how they saw me. I could cure cancer, win a Nobel Prize, or become the youngest CEO in Fortune 500 history, and they would still find reasons to worry, to doubt, to suggest I aim for something safer and smaller and more appropriate for someone like me. That was the moment I stopped calling home with good news. If they couldn't celebrate my victories, they didn't deserve to witness them. I graduated summa cum laude from Georgia Tech with 3 job offers and a patent application for an algorithm I'd developed during my senior project. I chose Microsoft because of Dr. Foster's mentorship and because Seattle felt like a place where I could reinvent myself completely, where nobody knew me as the quiet disappointment from a family in Atlanta. For 2 years, I thrived in Seattle. The Pacific Northwest suited my temperament, gray and introspective, and beautiful in unexpected ways. I worked on cutting-edge neural networks that would eventually revolutionize how computers process natural language. I published papers in academic journals and started building a reputation in the AI community as someone whose insights were worth paying attention to. But part of me still craved connection with home, still hoped that distance and success would somehow bridge the gap between who I was and who they needed me to be. That hope died completely during my second Christmas back home. I'd been excited to share news about a breakthrough I'd achieved at work, a neural network design that could predict cybersecurity threats with 98% accuracy. It was groundbreaking research that had the potential to save companies millions of dollars and protect sensitive data from increasingly sophisticated attacks. As the family gathered around the Christmas tree that year, the same tree I'd admired from across the room as a child, never quite feeling like I belonged in the family photos taken in front of it, I started to explain what I'd been working on. My father interrupted before I'd spoken for 30 seconds. "That's nice, honey. But Marcus just closed his biggest real estate deal ever. $3 million. Now that's the kind of success you can see and touch." Marcus grinned, accepting congratulations from everyone around the tree. "Yeah, sis, all those computers are impressive and everything, but can you flip them for profit? Real estate is real money." Everyone laughed except me. I sat there holding a research paper that could change how the entire internet protected itself from attack, watching my family celebrate my brother's ability to convince someone to pay an inflated price for property in a market bubble that was clearly unsustainable. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the same furniture and posters from high school, I made a decision that would shape the next decade of my life. I was done performing for an audience that would never applaud, done seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of understanding what I was trying to build. I was going to create something so significant, so undeniably successful, that it wouldn't matter whether they understood it or not. Not because I needed their approval, but because I needed to prove to myself that the voice in my head that sounded like my father was wrong about what was possible for someone like me. 6 months later, I quit my job at Microsoft. Dr. Foster tried to talk me out of it. "You're on track to be promoted to senior engineer within 18 months, she told me during our final meeting. "The work you're doing here is important, and you have a clear path to leadership." "I know," I said, packing my desk into a small cardboard box. "But I need to build something of my own. I need to prove that I can create value, not just add to what someone else has already built." She smiled, and I could see in her eyes the recognition of something she'd felt herself years earlier. "Where are you going?" "Home," I said. "Back to Atlanta. I'm going to start my own company. AI. Cybersecurity. I want to build predictive systems that can stop attacks before they happen, instead of just responding after the damage is done." Dr. Foster wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to me. It was her personal email address and phone number. "When you need advice or funding or just someone who understands what you're trying to do, call me. What you're attempting to build. It's not just a business opportunity. It's necessary. The internet is becoming more dangerous every day, and we need people like you building the solutions." I moved back to Atlanta, but not to be closer to family. I came back because the cost of living was lower than Seattle, because the tech scene was growing, but not yet saturated, and because part of me wanted to prove that I could build something significant in the same city where I'd been told my dreams were impractical. NeuralSync Technologies began in a shared workspace in Midtown, in a converted warehouse that smelled like coffee and optimism, and the kind of focused desperation that drives people to risk everything for the chance to build something that matters. I was 24 years old, working 18-hour days on an algorithm that could analyze network traffic patterns and predict cyber attacks with unprecedented accuracy. My office was a desk wedged between a startup that was trying to revolutionize food delivery and another that was building VR training simulations for medical students. The first year was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. I lived off my savings from Microsoft, eating ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, coding until my wrists ached and my eyes burned. When the system crashed, which happened frequently in those early days, I rebuilt it from scratch, learning from each failure and making the algorithm stronger. When potential investors withdrew their interest, I refined my pitch and found new ones. When my first hire quit after 2 weeks because he didn't believe a black woman could successfully lead a tech company, I hired someone better and kept building. I learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed, to negotiate contracts that protected my intellectual property while still giving clients the confidence to trust a one-person startup with their cybersecurity needs. There were nights when I sat in that shared workspace at 2 a.m, surrounded by the quiet hum of other people's dreams, wondering if I was delusional to think I could build something significant on my own. But every time I doubted myself, I thought about Dr. Foster's words, "What you're attempting to build, it's necessary." And I thought about that 12-year-old girl at the science fair, standing behind her project with a first-place ribbon, explaining weather prediction algorithms to adults who thought she was cute, but not capable of understanding what she'd actually accomplished. I wasn't building Neuralink for that little girl, exactly, but I was building it with her determination, her refusal to accept other people's limitations as her own. At one point, about 8 months into the company's existence, my bank account dipped below $50. I had enough money for either groceries or the internet bill, but not both. For a moment, sitting in my studio apartment with my laptop balanced on my knees, I considered calling my parents and asking for a loan. I could imagine the conversation. "What happened to all that independence you were so proud of?" my father would ask. "Maybe it's time to come home and get a real job." I chose the internet bill and lived on peanut butter sandwiches for a week. Everything changed when Regional Medical Center, one of Atlanta's largest hospital systems, suffered a devastating cyber attack that compromised the personal information of over 200,000 patients. The breach made national news, not just because of its scale, but because it highlighted how vulnerable healthcare systems had become to increasingly sophisticated attacks. I sent an email to their CTO the day after the story broke, offering a free demo of Neuralink's predictive threat detection system. I explained that my algorithm could identify and neutralize attacks before they breached perimeter defenses, essentially stopping hackers at the front door, instead of trying to catch them after they'd already gotten inside. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in their conference room, laptop open, heart pounding, as I demonstrated how my system had identified the attack patterns that led to their breach 3 days before it actually happened. "You're telling me this algorithm saw the attack coming?" their CTO asked, leaning forward in his chair. "More than that," I said, clicking through screens of data that showed the attack's progression. It identified the specific vulnerabilities the attackers were probing, the timing of their reconnaissance activities, and the most likely entry points they would use. If this system had been in place, we could have closed those vulnerabilities and blocked their access before they ever got inside your network. The room was silent for a moment. Then their security director spoke up. "How long have you been working on this?" 2 years of active development, but the underlying research goes back to my graduate work at Georgia Tech, I said, which was true, even though I'd never actually gone to graduate school. I'd taught myself everything through papers, online courses, and countless hours of experimentation. 3 weeks later, they signed a contract for $500,000. 6 months after that, Regional Medical had not only avoided any additional breaches, but had become a case study in proactive cybersecurity that other hospital systems wanted to emulate. Word spread quickly in the healthcare industry, which was becoming increasingly aware of how vulnerable their systems were to attack. Within 18 months, Neuralink had contracts with 12 major hospital systems across the Southeast, and I was hiring my first employees. By the 3rd year, we'd expanded beyond healthcare into financial services and government contracting. The algorithm had evolved into a full suite of predictive security tools that could adapt to new types of threats in real time. We had offices in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Miami, with plans to expand to the West Coast. And through it all, my family had no idea what I was building. They still saw me as the single mother who'd made poor choices, the daughter who'd been too stubborn to marry the father of her child, the sister who worked with computers in some vague capacity that they didn't understand, or particularly care to understand. When Devin came back into the picture during Zara's 3rd birthday, showing up unannounced with expensive gifts and promises about wanting to be a better father, I was already worth $7 million on paper. But to my family, I was still the woman who'd been abandoned by her child's father, still someone to be pitied rather than celebrated. I said yes when he proposed 6 months later, not because I loved him, but because I was tired of being seen as incomplete. Marriage would legitimize me in their eyes, would finally make me acceptable in a way that all my professional success hadn't managed to achieve. The wedding was small and elegant, held at the Ritz-Carlton in Buckhead. My family attended, dressed in their finest clothes, taking photos and posting them to social media with captions about new beginnings and finding happiness. They seemed proud of me for the first time in years, not because I'd built a multi-million-dollar company, but because I'd finally done something they understood. I'd gotten a man. Devin moved into my house in Virginia Highland, the one I'd bought with the proceeds from my first major acquisition offer, which I'd turned down because I wasn't ready to sell. He quit his job as a venture capitalist, claiming he wanted to be more involved in Zara's daily life, though what he actually did most days was play golf and attend networking events where he could introduce himself as the husband of a successful tech entrepreneur. For a while, the arrangement worked. My family finally seemed to approve of my life choices. Devin was charming and handsome, and came from the kind of family background they respected. Zara was happy to have a father figure around, even if he was more interested in the idea of being a dad than the actual work of parenting. But I should have known that a relationship built on external validation, rather than genuine connection, was destined to crumble under pressure. The cracks started showing during my 4th year of running NeuralSync, when the company was valued at $22 million and acquisition offers were arriving weekly. Success at that level brings scrutiny, and scrutiny reveals truth. Devin started making comments about my work schedule, my dedication to the company, my reluctance to delegate important decisions to other people. "You're obsessed with this business," he'd say, after I'd spend a weekend troubleshooting a critical issue. "You act like the whole company will collapse if you're not watching every detail." "It's my company," I'd respond, trying to keep my voice level. "I built it from nothing. I can't just hand over control to other people and hope for the best." "Other people manage to run successful businesses without working 80 hours a week," he'd counter. "Maybe you need to learn to trust your team more, or maybe you're just addicted to being needed." The criticism stung because it echoed the same concerns my family had been expressing for years, that I was too intense, too focused, too unwilling to prioritize anything other than my work. But what they didn't understand, what Devin didn't understand, was that NeuralSync wasn't just a business to me. It was proof that the voice in my head that sounded like my father was wrong about what I was capable of achieving. The relationship deteriorated gradually, the way these things usually do. Arguments about my work schedule became arguments about everything else: how I parented Zara, how I interacted with his friends, how I managed our household finances. Devin wanted a wife who would complement his vision of himself as a successful man. I was a CEO who happened to be married. The final blow came when he started questioning my business decisions in front of other people, undermining my authority by suggesting that I was too emotional or too stubborn to make rational choices about the company's future. At a dinner party with several other couples from our social circle, people whose husbands worked in finance or real estate, whose wives were either stay-at-home mothers or had careers that were clearly secondary to their husbands, Devin started telling a story about how I'd rejected another acquisition offer. "Keisha's so attached to this company," he said, laughing as if my dedication was endearingly irrational. "I keep telling her that $25 million is a lot of money, that maybe it's time to sell and enjoy life a little bit, but she's convinced she can build something even bigger." The other wives nodded sympathetically, as if they understood the burden of being married to someone so unreasonably ambitious. Their husbands looked at me with a mixture of admiration and confusion, clearly wondering why I would turn down that kind of money. Sometimes you have to know when you've won, one of them said. 25 million is more than most people see in a lifetime. I sat there, sipping wine that cost more than my first laptop, listening to people who'd never built anything significant discuss the value of my life's work as if it were a lottery ticket I was too greedy to cash in. Devin basked in their support, validated by a room full of people who shared his belief that I was being unreasonable. That night, lying in bed next to a man who fundamentally didn't understand what I was trying to build or why it mattered, I realized that getting married had been a mistake. I'd traded my autonomy for acceptance from people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered to me in the first place. But I stayed for another year, partly because divorce felt like admitting failure, and partly because I wasn't ready to become a single mother again in the eyes of my family. I thought I could make it work through compromise and patience and the kind of quiet endurance I'd learned as a child. I was wrong. The end came suddenly, the way these things often do after building slowly for months. I was in our home office, working late on a presentation for potential investors, when Devin came in and announced that he'd accepted a job offer in Chicago. I thought we could both use a fresh start, he said, as if this major life decision was something we'd discussed rather than something he'd decided unilaterally. Chicago has a great tech scene. You could probably find someone to buy Neuralink and we could start over. I'm not selling the company, I said, not looking up from my laptop, and I'm not moving to Chicago. You're not even going to discuss it? There's nothing to discuss. This is my life's work. I'm not walking away from it so you can feel important in a new city. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see something shift in his expression. You know what your problem is, Keisha. You care more about being successful than you do about being happy. You'd rather be CEO of some company than be a good wife and mother. I closed my laptop and looked at him directly. I can be all of those things. But apparently, you can't handle being married to someone who's more successful than you are. That's not what this is about, isn't it? You were fine with my success when you thought it was temporary, when you thought I'd eventually choose you over the company. But now that you realize I'm not going to sacrifice my career for your ego, suddenly I'm obsessed and unreasonable. The conversation escalated from there. All the resentment and disappointment we'd been storing for months spilling out in accusations and ultimatums. By the time we were both exhausted, the relationship was clearly over, even if neither of us was ready to say it out loud. Devin moved out 3 days later. The divorce was finalized 8 months after that. And just like that, I was a single mother again, with a company worth $30 million, and a family who saw my divorce as proof that I'd made the wrong choice again. I told you that man was too good to be true, my mother said when I called to tell her about the separation. Successful men don't want wives who are more focused on work than family. You can't have everything, Keisha. I don't want everything, I said, standing in my empty house, looking out at the garden I'd planted myself because Devin had never been interested in yard work. I just want what's mine. But even as I said it, I knew she couldn't understand what I meant. To her, a woman's worth was still measured by her ability to attract and keep a man, regardless of what she might accomplish on her own. My success was interesting, but it wasn't fulfilling in the way that marriage and traditional family life were supposed to be. I stopped trying to explain my choices to them after that conversation. If they couldn't celebrate my victories or support my decisions, then they didn't deserve access to either. The next few years were the most focused and productive of my life. Without the distraction of trying to maintain a marriage that was fundamentally incompatible with who I was, I threw myself completely into building Neuralink into the kind of company I'd always envisioned. We expanded into international markets, opened offices in London and Tokyo, and developed new applications for our predictive algorithms that extended far beyond cybersecurity. By the time Zara turned 6, Neuralink was being courted by acquisition offers that started at $50 million and kept climbing. I turned them all down, not because I was attached to owning the company, but because I wasn't ready to stop building. There were still problems to solve, still innovations to develop, still barriers to break through in an industry that wasn't always welcoming to people who looked like me. And through it all, my family remained completely oblivious to what I was accomplishing. They knew I worked with computers, that I traveled frequently for business, that I could afford a nice house and good schools for Zara, but they had no idea that I was building something that would fundamentally change how the internet protected itself from attack, that I was being featured in TechCrunch and Harvard Business Review, that venture capitalists and industry leaders were studying my algorithms and business model. To them, I was still the daughter who'd made questionable life choices, still the sister who worked too hard and cared too little about traditional markers of success, still the single mother who needed to find a good man and settle down before it was too late. It might have continued that way indefinitely, with me building my empire in secret, while they continued to see me as a cautionary tale, except for one small detail: my father's financial problems. Robert Williams had built his real estate empire during the boom years of the early 2000s, leveraging properties and flipping contracts in a market that seemed like it could only go up. But markets that seem too good to be true usually are, and when the housing bubble burst in 2008, he found himself holding properties he couldn't sell and debts he couldn't service. He lost his real estate license in 2015 after a client complaint revealed that he'd been mishandling escrow funds, using money from one deal to cover debts from another. The scandal made the local business pages, and suddenly the man who'd spent my childhood lecturing me about the importance of stable, traditional careers was unemployed and unemployable. Pride prevented him from admitting the extent of his financial problems, but family gossip travels fast. I heard through Kenya that my parents were having trouble making their mortgage payments, that Marcus's real estate business was struggling without Dad's connections, that the comfortable middle-class lifestyle they'd all taken for granted was suddenly unsustainable. That's when I made what was probably the most emotionally complicated decision of my life. I started the Anonymous Family Trust. Every month, $7,000 flowed into their various accounts from what they were told was an investment inheritance from my grandmother's estate, administered by a lawyer whose instructions were to maintain complete anonymity about the benefactor's identity. The money was enough to cover their mortgage, car payments, and basic expenses, with a little left over for the kind of discretionary spending that maintained their illusion of prosperity. My father never questioned where the money came from, because he desperately needed it to be legitimate. My mother never questioned it, because she was grateful to have financial security again. Marcus and Kenya never questioned it, because they assumed Dad's previous success had generated some kind of residual income they didn't need to understand. For 3 years, I was their invisible benefactor, the ghost in their prosperity, watching them post photos of vacations and new cars and home renovations on social media, while they continued to treat me like the family failure who worked with computers and couldn't keep a husband. Marcus bought a boat with money I'd provided. Kenya got cosmetic surgery funded by my success. My parents renovated their kitchen with cabinets and appliances that my algorithms had purchased. The irony was exquisite, but it was also heartbreaking. I wasn't supporting them out of generosity or love. I was doing it because cutting them off completely felt like admitting that family was nothing more than shared DNA, that the bonds I'd spent my childhood yearning for were completely imaginary. I wanted to believe that deep down, underneath their inability to see or celebrate my achievements, they loved me enough to change. I wanted to believe that if I provided for them long enough, eventually, they would recognize my worth and choose to include me in their definition of family success. I was wrong about that too. The Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything happened 3 weeks after Goldman Sachs had valued Neuralink at $35 million, and 6 days after I'd received acquisition offers from 3 different Fortune 500 companies. I was literally days away from becoming one of the youngest Black women ever to have a tech exit at that level, but my family had no idea. When my mother called to invite me to dinner, her voice was warmer than it had been in years. "We miss you and Zara," she said. "It's been too long since we've all been together. Your father specifically asked me to make sure you'd be there. I should have known it was a trap." My father never specifically asked for my presence unless he wanted an audience for something. But I was feeling optimistic about the acquisition discussions, hopeful that maybe this could be the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship. I spent hours planning what I would wear, what gifts to bring, how to present the news about my company's success in a way that might finally earn their respect. I imagined their faces when I told them about the acquisition offers, the moment when they would realize that their quiet, unremarkable daughter had built something extraordinary. Instead, I walked into an ambush. They'd clearly been drinking before I arrived, and the conversation had an edge of aggression that I didn't immediately understand. Marcus kept making subtle digs about my lifestyle, my parenting choices, my inability to maintain a relationship. Kenya kept asking pointed questions about my finances, whether I was managing to support Zara adequately, whether I ever thought about moving back in with family to save money. My father was quieter than usual, but his silence felt loaded, like a storm gathering strength. The explosion came when Zara accidentally spilled her water glass, reaching for a dinner roll across the wide expanse of their dining table. It was a small accident, the kind of thing that happens when you seat a 6-year-old at a formal dinner table designed for adults. But my father's reaction was volcanic. "For God's sake!" he shouted, slamming his palm against the table hard enough to make the crystal stemware jump. "Can't you control your child? That tablecloth is imported lace. It cost more than most people spend on furniture." Zara burst into tears, huge sobs that shook her small frame. I moved to comfort her, but my father wasn't done. "This is exactly what happens when children grow up without proper supervision," he continued, his voice rising. "No discipline, no respect for other people's property. Just chaos and mess wherever they go." "Dad, stop," I said, my voice sharp with protective anger. "She's 6 years old. It was an accident. An accident that wouldn't have happened if she'd been taught proper table manners," he shot back. "But I guess that's too much to expect from someone who can't even keep a father around to help with the parenting." The room went silent, except for Zara's quiet sniffling. Marcus smirked, clearly enjoying the drama. Kenya looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. My mother busied herself with cleaning up the spilled water, her movements quick and nervous. And I realized, sitting there with my daughter crying in my arms, and my family watching our humiliation with satisfaction, that they hadn't invited me to dinner because they missed me. They'd invited me because they needed someone to blame for their own frustrations, someone to make themselves feel superior to. I was their designated failure, the cautionary tale they told themselves about what happened when you didn't follow the conventional path. And no amount of success or generosity or patient endurance was going to change that role. "You know what, Dad?" I said, standing up and lifting Zara into my arms. "You're absolutely right. It is my fault." He looked surprised, clearly expecting more argument, more defensive explanations. "It's my fault for thinking that blood relation meant something more than shared DNA," I continued, my voice calm but carrying the kind of finality that comes with absolute clarity. "It's my fault for believing that family meant supporting each other instead of tearing each other down. And it's definitely my fault for exposing my daughter to people who think love comes with conditions and exceptions." "Keisha, don't be dramatic," my mother said, her voice pleading. "Your father didn't mean—" "He meant every word," I interrupted. "Just like he meant it when he told me I'd never succeed in technology. Just like he meant it when he said I was too stubborn to find a good man. Just like he's meant every criticism and dismissal and prediction of failure for the past 28 years. Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly ready to add his own commentary to the situation. "Come on, sis. You're acting like..." "Like what?" I asked, turning to face him directly. "Like someone who's tired of being treated as less than? Like someone who finally realizes that respect isn't something you can earn from people who are determined not to give it?" "You're being oversensitive," Kenya said, finally joining the conversation. "Family is supposed to challenge each other. We're just trying to help you see things clearly." I looked around the table at their faces, these people who shared my genes but had never shared my dreams, who had benefited from my success while dismissing my ambitions, who seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset. "Thank you for dinner," I said, gathering Zara's coat and my purse. "I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening." "Keisha, wait," my mother called as I headed toward the door. "Don't leave like this. It's Thanksgiving." I turned back one last time, taking in the scene. The expensive china, the imported tablecloth my father had been so concerned about, the crystal chandelier casting warm light over the kind of domestic perfection that magazines feature in their holiday spreads. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said quietly. "I'm grateful for the clarity." And then Zara and I walked out into the November evening, leaving behind the family that had never truly been ours. The drive home was quiet, except for the soft music playing on the radio, and Zara's occasional sniffles as she processed what had happened. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the steering wheel, my mind already moving forward to what came next. "Mommy," Zara said softly as we pulled into our driveway. Are we going to see them again? I considered the question as I turned off the engine, looking up at our house with its warm lights glowing behind the windows, thinking about the life we'd built together inside those walls. Maybe someday, I said finally, if they learn how to be kind to the people they're supposed to love. Okay, she said, accepting this explanation the way children accept most truths about the adult world, without fully understanding but trusting that the grown-ups will figure it out eventually. That night, after putting Zara to bed and reading her 3 extra stories to help settle her emotions, I sat at my laptop and began systematically canceling every automatic transfer to the family trust. Each canceled transaction felt like cutting a rope that had been pulling me underwater for years. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires emotional investment, and I had finally realized that my family wasn't worth the energy it would take to sustain rage. I was simply done. The next morning, I called my lawyer, my business partner Maya, and my financial advisor. It was time to accept one of those acquisition offers. It was time to build the kind of life that Zara deserved, surrounded by people who understood that love wasn't supposed to hurt. When the acquisition was announced 6 weeks later, the technology press coverage was extensive. Forbes ran a feature story about young entrepreneurs who'd built companies worth tens of millions before age 30. TechCrunch analyzed the sale as evidence that AI-driven cybersecurity was the next major growth sector. Harvard Business Review published a case study about how NeuralSync had revolutionized predictive threat detection. I gave interviews to several publications, always focusing on the technical innovations, the importance of diversity in tech leadership, and the growing need for proactive rather than reactive cybersecurity measures. I never mentioned my family, but I knew they saw the articles. In a small city like Atlanta, news about a local entrepreneur selling her company for $35 million doesn't stay secret long. The phone calls started within hours of the first article going live. First, my mother. Keisha, honey, I saw the article in the Business Journal. I had no idea. We need to talk. Then Kenya. Girl, why didn't you tell us you were building something this big? We're family. Then Marcus. Sis, I always knew you had it in you. We should celebrate. And hey, I've got some investment opportunities you might be interested in. I didn't return any of the calls. I'd said everything I needed to say at that Thanksgiving table. And their sudden interest in my success only confirmed that I'd made the right decision in walking away. My father never called directly, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been telling people he'd always believed in my potential, that he'd encouraged my interest in technology from an early age, that he was proud to see his daughter achieving such success. The revisionist history was breathtaking and somehow perfect. Even faced with undeniable evidence of my accomplishments, he found a way to center himself in the narrative, to claim credit for achievements he'd spent decades undermining. I wasn't surprised. I was grateful. His delusion confirmed that I'd made the right choice in cutting ties before they could find new ways to diminish what I'd built. Over the next few months, as I navigated life after the acquisition, investing the proceeds, planning my next venture, adjusting to sudden wealth, I also navigated the strange experience of being pursued by a family that had never pursued me before. They sent gifts to Zara. They invited me to events and celebrations. They posted old photos of me on social media with captions about always believing in family and being proud of their successful sister-daughter. Kenya even started telling people that she'd given me the idea for my first algorithm, which was impressive revisionist history, considering she'd never shown any interest in my work until it became profitable. I ignored all of it, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I'd spent 30 years trying to earn their approval, and I finally understood that people who only value you after you become valuable are not people worth maintaining relationships with. Instead, I focused on building something new, a life that didn't require anyone else's validation to feel complete. I bought a house in Virginia Highland, walking distance from Piedmont Park, with enough space for Zara to run and play and grow up feeling like she belonged. I started a foundation that provided mentorship and funding for women entrepreneurs, particularly those working in technology and facing the same barriers I'd encountered early in my career. I reconnected with Dr. Foster, who'd become a vice president at Amazon and was eager to collaborate on initiatives that would increase diversity in tech leadership. I strengthened my friendship with Maya, my former business partner, who understood the peculiar challenges that came with success in an industry that wasn't always welcoming to people who looked like us. Most importantly, I created the kind of family environment for Zara that I'd always wished I'd had, one where achievements were celebrated, curiosity was encouraged, and love was abundant and unconditional. We established our own traditions, holiday celebrations that focused on gratitude and joy rather than obligation and performance. Last Thanksgiving, we hosted 15 people in our dining room, friends from work, neighbors who'd become chosen family, other single mothers who understood the challenges of building something significant while raising children alone. The table was set with mismatched plates that told stories, flowers from our garden, and enough laughter to fill every empty space my biological family had left behind. When we went around the table sharing what we were grateful for, Zara said, "I'm thankful for Mommy's big brain and all the people who love us for real." I realized then that I'd spent most of my life at the wrong table, begging for scraps of affection from people who were never going to feed me properly. The moment I stood up and walked away, I found the feast I'd been looking for all along. Now, 2 years after that final Thanksgiving dinner, I wake up every morning in a house filled with peace rather than tension, surrounded by people who celebrate my victories instead of questioning my worth. Zara is thriving in a school that recognizes her intelligence and creativity, growing up with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing she's loved without conditions. I'm working on my next company, focusing on AI applications for educational technology, building tools that will help other children who learn differently have access to personalized learning experiences. The work is challenging and fulfilling in ways that feel completely separate from any need to prove myself to anyone else. Sometimes people ask if I miss my family, if I regret cutting them off so completely. The honest answer is that I miss the family I thought they could become, but I don't miss the family they actually were. I miss the fantasy, not the reality, and I'm grateful for the lesson they taught me, even if they never intended to, that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. Zara will grow up knowing she's celebrated for exactly who she is, that her achievements matter because they represent her effort and creativity, not because they serve someone else's definition of success. She'll know that family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up consistently, who celebrates your victories authentically, and who loves you not despite your ambitions, but because of them. The little girl who once built weather prediction algorithms for a science fair audience that wasn't paying attention grew up to revolutionize cybersecurity for companies that depend on her innovations. And now she's building a new generation of educational tools that will help other overlooked children realize their potential. That 12-year-old who stood behind her project with a first-place ribbon, explaining complex algorithms to adults who thought she was cute but not capable, would be proud of who I became. Not because of the money or the recognition or the validation from industry leaders, but because I learned to value my own worth enough to walk away from people who couldn't see it. The girl who once played piano for empty chairs grew up to conduct an orchestra of her own choosing. And this time, everyone in the audience is there because they want to be, applauding not out of obligation, but out of genuine appreciation for the music we're making together. That Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago wasn't the end of my family story. It was the beginning of the one I was always meant to write. If you've ever had to choose yourself over people who couldn't see your worth, I hope you know that walking away from toxicity isn't giving up. It's growing up. Tell me in the comments, what does chosen family mean to you? And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and stay for more stories about resilience, success, and the courage to rewrite your own ending. Sometimes the best revenge is a life so beautiful they can't believe they missed being part of it.